Okay, I'm Kyron Skinner, and I direct the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University. Mainly everyone here is a CMU person, but I did invite one or two others, and I thank you all for being here. Somehow, in the age of Zoom, we still have a very nice show up rate for our events, and we have quite a few, as you know, and just to give a little advertising. Next week, we have Condoleezza Rice, first African-American woman to be National Security Advisor and Secretary of State and Provost at Stanford, now Director of the Hoover Institution. But today we have Marcia Chatelain, a young woman, up-and-coming scholar, thinker. Before I really introduce her, I'd like to first thank Ali Frymoyer, who will give us instructions. She's on the IPS team and she manages all of these events. And Bill Brink for doing the publicity work and joining and making all of this happen. Let me turn it over to Ali, who will then turn it back to me. I think she has some instructions for this meeting. And thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Dr. Skinner, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Just a couple of house rules today. Once we get to the Q&A section, we are taking questions live, so please use the raise hand function. If you are able to turn on your camera, please do so. And also, if you are not comfortable asking your question live, please feel free to put it in the chat to me, and I will relay that question on your behalf anonymously. Back to you, Dr. Skinner.
Thank you. I'll jump in with an introduction of our guest speaker. And I think it's so important that we have her speak with us at this time. I believe I invited her earlier, but she is in great demand given the work that she's doing and the challenges that we're facing as a nation. So it's just wonderful that I got her on our schedule this semester. Marcia Chatelain is a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. She's the author of South Side Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration. And we just found out that we're both from Chicago. I'm from the South Side. I'm not sure if she is, but that book came out with Duke University Press in 2015. And she teaches about women's and girls' history, as well as Black capitalism. Her latest book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, is an important book published by Norton in 2020. It examines the intricate relationship among African-American politicians, civil rights organizations, communities, and the fast food industry. She is a current co-host of the Slate podcast, The Waves, which covers feminism, gender, and current events. An active public speaker, an educational consultant, Professor Chatelain has received numerous awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the American Association of University Women. At Georgetown, she's won numerous awards for her teaching, and the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2016 named her a top influencer in academia in recognition of her social media campaign, #FergusonSyllabus, which implored educators to facilitate discussions about the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri, in the year 2014. She's held an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellowship at New America, a major think tank, a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship, and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, which in some ways links her to us at Carnegie Mellon. So I would like to just jump into the conversation with Marcia by letting her speak to us. I'll ask an initial prompt or two, but then open the discussion up for your questions, of which I hope there will be many. So over to you, Professor Chatelain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skinner, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. It seems like we've had an incredibly long week in this country as we're trying to keep tabs on the election, as we get both the devastating news about the coronavirus and some hopeful news about the potential for a vaccine. And so I think that this past week, like the past few years, has been one in which we're really grappling with a series of mixed emotions about where we are in the present and imagining the future. I want to thank the Institute for inviting me to talk about Breonna Taylor, because in the various invitations I get to speak, I sometimes have the opportunity to talk about my research on Black capitalism and post-1968 politics. Sometimes I talk about inclusive teaching, and increasingly, I find myself really wanting to talk about Black women as public servants, as people in the public eye, and as prisms for understanding the many dynamics of American politics and policy, as well as race in America. So today I want to think a little bit about Breonna Taylor's life and death as it relates to the past 4 to 5 decades in American policy, because I think these stories of police brutality and state-sanctioned violence help us uncover the many layers of what it means to live in the US, as well as some of the pressing questions about how we understand safety and how we understand law and order. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old young woman who was an EMT who was spending the night in her apartment with her boyfriend when 3 members of the Louisville Metro Police Department issued a no-knock warrant on her apartment and shot her boyfriend and shot her and killed her on March 13th, 2020. Breonna Taylor's death formed one of a number of stories that animated protests this summer that was sparked largely in Minneapolis by the death of George Floyd, but in the reckoning over the death of George Floyd, other stories of African Americans who were killed by police joined it as a way of understanding a question about where the country was in 2020. And so although she was killed in the spring of 2020, it wasn't until after the summer, where the George Floyd protests were picking up, that her story became more and more visible to a public audience. And I think that's important. I'm going to talk a little bit about how gender factors into the ways that we think about police brutality. But I want to think about a few things in Breonna Taylor's story that's really important. She was kind of at the nexus of a number of policy decisions that were made in the 1980s that we know have disproportionately affected African Americans. And I want to think about the war on drugs, because we are living in an era where the critique on the war on drugs and the critique of the crime bill and the critique of mass incarceration has gone from a kind of fringe critique of the state to one that can create even bipartisan agreement. I think one of the largest cultural shifts that we've seen is the ways that people on the right and the left have come to some kind of agreement and understanding that hyper-policing and mass incarceration is a problem. And even though people from either kind of ideological camp may argue against it in different ways, we know that we have a problem. When I talk to my students about the war on drugs, I highly recommend that they go to YouTube and they listen to Reagan's first speech about the war on drugs, because it was not about the kind of things that we realize the war on drugs focused on by the late 80s and the early 1990s. He was talking about racketeering. He was talking about organized crime. And he actually saw the war on drugs as a mechanism to deal with police corruption. And so the framework for the war on drugs started in this kind of orbit of organized crime. And it devolved into what we have seen are a series of policies and practices that have broken African-American communities. And I think that this is important because I think that we have to be so discerning about intent and origin and application of these policies. And the idea that drug offenses, whether it's low-level drug dealing or high-level drug cartels, are equally problematic for society and have to be equally pursued, is some of the stuff that we saw in Breonna Taylor's case. And so there's been a lot of confusion as to why exactly the police were issuing this no-knock warrant at her apartment. And it involved her ex-boyfriend, not the boyfriend that she was with the night she was killed. Her ex-boyfriend, it was believed, had received drugs at her apartment. And so her apartment was added to a warrant, although the ex-boyfriend's apartment had also been searched by the police. There were a number of procedures that happened that night that went against protocol of issuing a no-knock warrant, including the fact that there was an ambulance that had been on site before the warrant was delivered, before the police entered her home. And then the ambulance was told to go. And by the time that she was shot, there was no kind of emergency medical capacity on site. So there was just a number of things that were under contention, whether or not the police actually announced themselves. But in a sense, all of these facts, whether or not the police followed the rules, are kind of irrelevant when we look at the ways that another intervention in a larger issue, the one of the Supreme Court protecting the police. So the no-knock warrant was introduced in 1995 in a case called Wilson versus Arkansas that essentially said that in order to protect the police from being in a situation where they announce themselves and a person discards evidence, that the no-knock warrant was constitutional because it was about the preservation of evidence. And so even though two states, Florida and Oregon, have banned the no-knock warrant, it is constitutionally protected. And so we see that even in cases where the public, they are not sitting well with these policies, they are protected by the courts. And I think that this is one of the civic lessons that people have learned since 2014 with the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, that police violence, that if a police officer claims that they feel like their life is threatened, that excessive force is very much protected by the courts. Why is this important? Well, when we think about the public interventions in cases like the Breonna Taylor case, we see really the limits of the power of the people to intervene, to try to create correctives. Although the city of Louisville then put an end to the no-knock warrant as a matter of policy and procedure in that city, it is not necessarily against the law or in violation of the Constitution to do that. The other issue that I want to bring up is one about the media attention that emerged after Breonna Taylor's death. And I think that this is a place where people have sat with a lot of discomfort in some of the ways that celebrities and activists and everyday people using social media tried to amplify her death as a way to try to get justice. And so we saw things like gatherings called BreonnaCon, which was using the label that's used for comic book enthusiasts like Comic-Con, using it around Breonna Taylor. Oprah broke protocol from her magazine and had an artist rendering of Breonna Taylor on the cover. There were these various ways in which the sloganeering strategies of social media were used to try to amplify the story of Breonna Taylor. And I think for some people, they found it distasteful. Others wondered if it actually effectively did anything to create a substantive conversation about what happened to her. But I want to say this, and I often hear this type of critique when people talk about the use of social media to amplify various causes, whether it's racial justice or economic justice or environmental issues, that even though Twitter has created this global platform for the discussion of political issues, I think that the use of slogans and the use of imagery is something that has long been with us in the history of activism. If you look at the strategies of organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was so central in the mid-century civil rights struggle, what did they do? They hired photographers, they printed posters, they made buttons, they produced films. They understood that in order to galvanize people around political campaigns, that you had to have messaging, you had to have provocative images, and you had to have something that was accessible and tangible to offer someone as an invitation to the deeper meanings and contours of the movement. So in the same ways that the hashtag #SayHerName has been used to amplify the fact that women are also victims of police brutality and excessive force, SNCC in 1964 would have used "For Freedom" or "One Man, One Vote," or in their attempt to raise awareness about police brutality, they would use an image of an Alabama state trooper and it would say, "Is he protecting you?" There's an iconic image you may have seen after the death of Congressman John Lewis, of John Lewis and his colleagues from SNCC praying at a segregated swimming pool in Cairo, Illinois, and the slogan is build a better world together, right? So all of this is standard political process that has its roots long before the civil rights movement. But I want to talk about how we stand in the discomfort of messaging, how we stand in the discomfort of how do we make sure we have substantive conversations about anecdotes that help us understand a complex set of circumstances. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have, is one about the movement for Black lives. The movement for Black lives, or Black Lives Matter, emerged in 2013 after the death of Trayvon Martin, but became really visible to a global audience after the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri. And one of the critiques of Black Lives Matter that many of you who follow movements heard was that Black Lives Matter resisted a kind of centralized leadership structure that groups like the NAACP and SNCC and CORE and the Urban League have had long used and continue to use to understand themselves. So there's no president of Black Lives Matter. You don't call a phone number and someone picks up the phone and says, "Hello, welcome to Black Lives Matter. How may I help you?" They resisted that kind of formation for a number of reasons. And I think they took a lot of heat and a lot of critique for it. And after the 2016 election, the kind of direct action mobilizations that we became familiar with in 2014 and 2015 kind of slowed down. And so there are all of these articles, and as a historian, I find this really funny, that 2 years after a moment, someone says, "Well, what happened to Black Lives Matter? Where are they now?" It's like, give them some time to figure some things out. So in 2016, 2017, there were all of these articles as to whether or not Black Lives Matter was a viable political formation because people didn't see direct action in the same way. But what happened in 2020, I think, was a vindication and an emphasis of what Black Lives Matter provided. And this is where we see the Breonna Taylor case animating this. Black Lives Matter provided not only a framework for grassroots mobilization that was defined by local needs and the leadership of local people, but it also provided a kind of civics lesson that I think we're all learning about how policing works in the US. I am curious the number of Americans who knew prior to 2014 that there was no federal standard for policing. I wonder how many people before 2014 were aware of programs that provided the discarded and unused equipment from the Department of Defense and made it available to local police departments. I'm wondering if a number of people had really thought about the limits and the failures, essentially, of body cameras. The night that Breonna Taylor was killed, the police officers were not wearing body cameras, but we've seen time and again since the issue of body cameras has been introduced as a solution to reducing police brutality, the fact that sometimes the cameras are not on, sometimes they have no audio, sometimes they are edited. And so I think what Black Lives Matter provided was not only a framework for activism and activation of networks so that Black Lives Matter in Louisville could respond to the question of Breonna Taylor, and Black Lives Matter Chicago could stand in solidarity, and that people, as a result of the George Floyd summer, could feel like they were supporting an umbrella ideology of Black Lives Matter. But it also, I think, raised the level of discourse as to how do we get to these issues of police brutality that have long plagued Black America. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm really going to open this up, is because one of the things that I found, I just wrote a book about McDonald's in Black America, and what does this have to do with policing? Well, the origins of McDonald's presence in African-American communities is immediately tied to 1968 and the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, when many communities were consumed with grief and experienced police violence and property destruction in response to his assassination. And in 1968, as was the case in 1945, as was the case in 1919 in Chicago, when African-American communities rise up and people take an analysis of why are people so upset, why are people so disenfranchised, the reasons are always really clear. A lack of decent jobs, a lack of opportunity for schooling for children, police brutality, and a lack of access for businesses within the community, right? And what's interesting is every time those responses are given to what's going on, it seems like there's a mechanism that will fuel business. And so after George Floyd, we hear support Black businesses. After King's assassination, Nixon pours millions of dollars into Black capitalism. But some of these core things, housing, policing, jobs, education, they get moved off of the table as to what to do. And so when we have moments of uprisings in cities like Louisville around Breonna Taylor, or cities like Chicago because of Laquan McDonald, or cities like Baltimore because of Freddie Gray, the responses are often put in this idea of business development or economic development, I think, at the detriment of some of the structural issues that lead to such tragedies as what happened to Breonna Taylor. And with that, I can't wait to hear the discussion and the questions from the audience.
Thank you for giving us a historical overview and helping us understand why you're so animated in your research on issues around Black women and violence against African Americans throughout our nation. I have so many questions, I don't know where I would want to begin. But I think my initial comment is one that's more about your personal journey, because I know that you'll get questions about your presentation. And we've been doing a journey series in this department, focusing on African American and faculty of color at CMU to kind of weave the narrative of their professional life and their personal development. And we just started, it's going very well. And so I'd like to ask you how you came to be interested in race and rights in America, which I think is the core of your work.
Yeah, I mean, it started with the lived experience. I'm from Chicago. I think about what was foundational for every generation. And so I was born in 1979. And so in terms of political formation, as like a little kid, I remember the election of Harold Washington as the mayor of Chicago, which was such a big deal, a Black mayor in a city like Chicago. And I remember the death of Harold Washington as being so devastating in the city. And, I grew up in a family of immigrants. We were very, very concerned about US foreign policy with Haiti, where my family's from. We were always engaged in kind of local level politics. I remember going with my mom to the polling place, but I remember like the key moments in my own formation as a kid was the uprising in Los Angeles in 1992 and being in all white schools. I always went to all white Catholic schools and really feeling deeply disappointed and hurt that school wasn't a place where I could talk about what was happening. that we were discouraged and kind of told that you don't go to school and talk about things that are happening, which I thought was weird. And I think that my own journey, growing up in the 1990s, a period of time that I think for many of my students, they can relate, in which you see incredible doors opening and progress, but you also see so many people kind of left behind. I went to college at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and University of Missouri became really known for its protest movement in 2005. But I went to college before social media, and we were organizing campaigns against hate crimes. And I came to teaching, and I came to thinking about a career in academia because I loved student organizing so much. Some campaigns we won, some we lost, but my favorite part is you'd be in a room full of people and there was a problem and they didn't know how they were going to solve it. And so you would spend some time talking about the history of movements on campus. You would come up with ideas together, and then all of a sudden you feel this incredible power that you were going to change something. It's like when you teach, a 3-year-old how to tie their shoe, they're like ready. Now they can run without falling. This is kind of amazing. And that was what student organizing gave me. And so that's what teaching has given me. So I did a PhD, which was a little weird. It's so funny that you asked me that question, and students sometimes ask me. I don't think I really knew what a PhD was. I was in the McNair Scholars Program. I was a beneficiary. The last thing I'll say about this, I think that I was part of the tail end of the affirmative action generation, in the sense that I went to college during a time where minority programs were not under assault the way that they would become in a little bit of a later era. So programs for first generation, low income, Black and Brown students were just kind of the order of the day, and then they got reorganized after some Supreme Court challenges. So I think I'm part of that last generation. So then, yeah, I just became a professor, which is so weird because most of my family had been service workers, janitors at nursing homes. My mom was an aid worker. And so I think, in conclusion, to wrap this up before I start crying, I think that my interest in race and inequality emanated from the fact that I very much still identify with the idea of the American dream. And I resent it so deeply because I feel like it is constituted on luck and timing, which are not sustainable factors for someone's survival. And so I'm acutely aware that I am fortunate and lucky. And that is a scary proposition, because there are people who are just not fortunate and not lucky, and what they need to survive in this country, I think, is appalling.
Well, that was very helpful to us, I think, to hear part of your story. And I think many of us on this call have elements of your story as well. And I will say that your observation is right, that there was a kind of drop off of quote unquote affirmative action around race that started to happen when you were coming of age. But it really started to unravel in 1977 with the Bakke decision.
Absolutely.
Which I was a teenager, so I'm a little older than you. And that was an earthquake through our lives, because my parents a decade earlier had been fighting in the civil rights movement. And here the Supreme Court comes along and says, the quota system or set aside for people of color or from lower income backgrounds is discriminatory. So I think we're coming full circle. And we at CMU, there's some department heads and senior faculty on this call, are committed to educating people of color and of different backgrounds, and they're finding ways to fund bringing them into the institution. So we're starting a course correction of the course correction that got destroyed for a whole host of reasons through the court system, as you described. Before we turn to the questions, which Allie will manage, I do have one, though. As I listen to you talk, it seems to me that the issue of that ultimately is Ferguson, that's Breonna Taylor, that's George Floyd, is multifactorial, and it's bipartisan. It's not one party or one administration, but it has happened over time. So when you talked about Breonna Taylor, it seems to me that it's partly some things that happened in the 1960s that we either legislated or were decided in the courts that may have had unintended effects in communities, in urban communities, and for people of color. By the 1980s, it's the war on drugs, which has had, as we know, so many unintended effects. It's hard to calculate them all. I think ultimately ending up in rural white America with the kinds of drug abuse that we've seen in the 2000s. If you had to say, give a scorecard for either party or a particular presidential administration, how would you do that, or would it even be possible?
I mean, everyone's getting an F. Like everyone is getting, I shouldn't say that, but everyone's getting pretty close to an F. And I will say, I'll put my cards on the table. I am a big government partisan kind of person in the sense that I actually believe in big state solutions to solve problems. I just think no one has tried it. And so, this past election, it gives so many mixed emotions. Someone had interviewed me about it and said, like, if the election happens, like, what should people do? I said, we have nothing to celebrate in this country, in the sense that the past 50 years in this country has been an abject and total failure in serving the needs of the most vulnerable. No one should feel good about themselves because we have been comfortable with not just bad policy, but when we see that the collateral damage of this bad policy are poor communities and communities of color, everyone just shrugs and say, well, I guess that's how it goes. I mean, listen, I'm a registered Democrat and I always vote for the Democratic Party. They're getting a D+. And I think the Republicans get the F-. And so both of them are failing miserably because the things that we fundamentally need, I'm so appalled by the behavior of Democrats who should know better, what they're doing this week, which is so upsetting to me. They're doing, and I talked about it this morning when I taught class. This rhetoric that down ballot Democrats lost because of defund the police and Medicare for all is insulting. And it's insulting because it's inaccurate, but B, more than anything else, the ways that I think the Republican Party has been very strong is that they set the terms of the political rhetoric, and the Democrats have no cogent, reasonable, and intelligent means of communicating what's real and what's false. And so they play into these things as if they're very real. I mean, we don't have to litigate rather about the election because it brought out just the worst in everyone. But this is what I will say. Every party is failing. And every time we have good ideas in this country, there is never the political will or patience to see them unfold. There is always a mechanism to undermine them, whether within or outside of the party. We have had bold and exciting ideas to end poverty. We've had bold and exciting ideas to end racial discrimination and segregation. We have bold and innovative ways to take care of people's most basic need. And the fact that we go back and forth on whether we should have healthcare for every person, that's the most disgusting thing I can imagine. This will be the last one. I really want to hear questions, but you just got me so fired up because I was talking about the civil rights movement today in class with the students. And we were talking about the voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think what I wanted to talk to the students about is the danger of using your opponent's rhetoric against yourself. During the civil rights movement, the number one way that segregationists and anti-civil rights forces undermine the civil rights movement, they didn't say that they thought Black and white people weren't equal. They said that sometimes, and they didn't say Black people were inferior. What they did is made people believe that the civil rights movement was a front for interracial sexual activity. They went at the heart of America's most disgusting preoccupation, and they just kept on saying it. They said, you know what SNCC is doing in Freedom Summer? They're not registering voters. They're just coming up with ways for Black and white people to have sex. And when schools wanting to be integrated, they say, are you sure you want your daughter next to that boy? What's going to happen? We're going to have a whole generation of mixed race babies. So that interracial sex, outside agitator, all of these different ideas become the term of the discourse when none of it is true. And you would say that by the standard of 1964, everyone was really dealing with a really delicate situation. But in 2020, for seasoned members of a political party to concede what actually is happening within their own party just shows the power of rhetoric to twist and distort. We are just coming off of a presidency that was really steeped in misinformation, and we see it being replicated by people who should know better and who should have learned from what happened. So I think everyone is failing miserably, but I believe there is hope. We have good ideas. If Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are very serious about racial justice, and they don't know what to do, and they don't have my phone number, and they're not going to call and ask me, this is what I'm going to offer. And if any of you know these people, please tell them this. You want to do something for racial justice in your first 100 days, you forgive student debt, you work on free college, Medicare for all. You start with these three things, and we will see an incredible, incredible opening up of the opportunity for people to live better lives. You add universal basic income to that, oh my gosh, the types of things that we can do. But again, I'm a big state partisan, so this is what I think we need to do. No one is doing it. And so I'm just deeply disappointed that in the middle of the pandemic, something as basic as Medicare for all is blasted as a pipe dream when we've had over 200,000 people die, and we have yet to know what the long-term effects of the coronavirus are on people's health and vitality. Oh, it upsets me so much.
Well, the questions are coming, but let me just say this. So I am involved in American politics like you, and I'm on the quote unquote other side on as a Republican. And what do you say to the fact that this election really shows first of all, we've had more people voting than ever in the US, how divided we are. So you're an American, you believe in our country, you believe in our system and our Constitution, but 70 million people have a very different view from you, at least. And everything that you've talked about with health insurance, with big government, they would say is socialist. Is that just rhetoric, or is that a reality of what you believe? Because there is a huge contest in this country about heading towards socialism, and abandoning individual freedom.
I mean, I think that's the great failure of our educational system, that when you have an educational system that's steeped in propaganda and is formulated around creating subjects who are supposed to be obedient to the state instead of thinkers, this is what happens. People will believe everything. I mean, I would love to see us colliding towards socialism. I mean, how is that going to happen? Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos are not going to let that happen. And we have a lot of Western states that we respect and allies that have been able to create better safety nets for their people. I mean, this is one of the big changes. We talk about being at the other end of the affirmative action generation. I remember early in my career as a professor, and for those of you of a certain age, you remember this. Do you remember when you used to get a job and have to get a second job for healthcare? And that was just normal in America. A person would have a 40-hour a week job that didn't have health care. And so you got another job so that in case you got sick, you didn't become bankrupt, but you still could become bankrupt. And this was normal. And then the Affordable Care Act said, okay, until you're 26, at least you can be on your parents' coverage. And what I saw happen, transformed, and both of us are Truman scholars, and we understand the importance of young people going into public service. My students could take jobs in public service because they could go to a doctor a few times a year. I mean, I think that's criminal. And so all of this is to say that when you have an educational system that is about conformity or creating a limited narrative about what structures of government are and what's good government, what's bad government, you have a populace that really believes that making sure people don't die early because they're sick or die broke because they're sick is this horrible socialist project, instead of the possibility of actually working to our greatest possibility as a democracy, in which we pay into public resources for a common good so that we don't leave our neighbor behind, is my response to that. I mean, listen, you're a real politician. I'm just someone who is always spouting out about my politics. But I think at the end of the day, this idea that we are all just kind of looking out for ourselves as individuals belies the fact that we rely on the state for so much. And I think that's good. I want to live in a country where people aren't left behind and alone because they don't have the same resources I do. And so I think that this is going to ultimately be the challenge. And the last thing I'm going to say, I used to live in Oklahoma. I lived in the places where the Tea Party and all of these movements emerged. People depend on the state there, but I think it's when communities of color need state assistance is when depending on the state becomes vilified and it becomes a problem.
Thank you. And that's a powerful observation. I've made that myself, but I would like to get on to the questions which may pull more of those ideas out of you. Allie, I'm turning over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Skinner. Professor Herbsleb, you had your hand up first, so please go ahead.
Yeah, first, let me just thank you for being here and talking to us. I'm glad you decided to accept this speaking engagement. I was very intrigued by, well, many things you said, but one of the things you said was that when things like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor come up and race and police brutality become the focus of what everybody's thinking, at least for a while, the effect is, as I understood what you to say, the effect is kind of paradoxical, that all of a sudden attention gets focused on new, maybe short-term programs that in the end don't do much good, and attention is taken away from the kind of fundamental structural reforms that you mentioned that would really make a difference. So, I mean, what does one do about that? Do we just need better rhetoric? Do we need some better understanding of the fundamental causal relationships that are at work here? Is there some manipulation of public opinion going on? You know, tell us what we could do better. What do we do about this?
You know, this is why popular education is so important. And that's why the activists who I think are the most enduring really do have a strong capacity for communication and clarity of ideas. And so one of the things that happened, and this is where everyone got very tense this summer, was that the prison abolition and the defund the police folks had an opportunity to get the microphone. And they said, this is what defund the police means. This is what we expect. And 90.99999% of Americans do not want to abolish police. No matter whose hot take you're listening to that abolish the police is the new clarion call of the 21st century, very few people actually believe in that. But what does that do? That rhetoric opens up the possibility for people to say, wait a second, how much does my city spend on policing? And really, really, really good messaging says, wait a second. Wait, how much are we spending on policing versus schools? Wait a second. We have police in schools that have the right to do X, Y, and Z to minors. Wait a second. And so when people talk about, people went too far with defund the police, you can say whatever you want. That's what makes America, America. But what is effective about introduction of that rhetoric is that when it's done really well, it opens up the possibility of scrutiny that I think we absolutely need. I don't know if I'll see the abolition of police in my lifetime. I think we first would need the abolition of private property, because policing is part of policing is the idea of protecting private property. I don't think we're there. But what I have seen already emerge is people saying, you know what? I don't know if I'm going to abolish the police, but does it really cost this much? Or how much does our city pay in these liability and settlement situations when there is police misconduct? Maybe that's a problem. Or when police unions suggest that there's no transparency in when police officers do something bad, you know what? I don't really sit well with that. And so I think that when we're talking about sustainable efforts, I think it's in the best interest of activists to make very clear what the goal is and direct people towards the things that can actually operate and move in their communities. And so I think it's about taking that step towards popular education that allows a person to plug into the places where they can make meaningful action because they're asking better and more thoughtful questions.
Could I just ask one follow-up to that? So I really like your analysis of the way that this could really start beneficial conversations and get people to dig more deeply into the role of the police and the cost of the police and other things that are not being funded. I think that's great. I think, though, that there's some percentage of the population, I don't know what it is, When they hear that, though, they don't dig into what it really means. They don't think deeply about the role of the police and the cost of the police. They have sort of a knee-jerk reaction. They curl up and say, no, they assume that you just mean you want chaos and disorder everywhere, and they won't be safe anymore. So you have these kind of different reactions, and I kind of wonder if that, causing that knee-jerk reaction isn't that more damaging almost than the thoughtful reaction and the conversations that it gives rise to?
I can't, I ultimately can't control how people react to any sort of messaging, but this is what I think we can do. I think that we can make some things clear and then invite people to come closer to a set of ideas. One person, one vote, all men are created equal. These are also there are people historically who had knee-jerk reactions to this idea, but sets of circumstances also shift. I mean, Black Lives Matter also elicited that. So we can see that having a strong reaction to something does not necessarily foreclose it as a possibility within our political imagination, is what I think. Because there have been a number of people I know who've changed their political positions after very strong reactions to something when they were confronted with the infrastructure around it. So yeah, you can turn me off once I say defund the police, that's fine, but I'm not the only person who's presenting a series of circumstances about policing that may make you return to that initial idea. So, I mean, I think it's tough work, but I think things that are worth fighting for are worth kind of agitating for, because without that, I don't know where we would be. But I hear you very closely that this isn't for everyone, but I think the after effects of it can be a little bit more beneficial than we imagine.
Thank you. Alex O, you're next.
Hello, Professor Chatelain. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I really like the enthusiasm you're bringing to the talk today. So my question kind of draws upon a great series on YouTube called Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man. And recently they featured police officers from the Petaluma Police Force. So I kind of want to pose a question to you that Emmanuel Osher, the host, posed to the officers. Do you think that it's possible, in your opinion, to kind of mend the perception that officers have Black people, and vice versa, the perception that Black people have of police officers? And if so, how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really hard. And this is also something that kind of grew out of 1968, that one of the kind of goals after the uprisings that happened throughout the late 60s was to say, you diversify police officers, you re-implement the idea that the police officer is a friendly kind of presence, and that's when you have officer friendly coming to your school. And then that later gives rise to the DARE officers, which were the kind of war on drug, kind of community relations. So there's all of these different strategies of how to kind of make people less anxious about policing. Here's the thing that I've come to think about more and more in this conversation. The historical baggage that some, not all, Black people have with policing is so strong that I think these things will only shift if there is really a national reckoning and reconciliation around the issue. And I think about this in terms of various people I know in my life who have never been very vocal about policing or activism in private spaces will tell me experiences that they've had with the police that are downright terrifying. And so what do we do with that baggage that can be so generational? There is another scholar who told a story about how her father was having a stroke and they called the police, and the police said, oh, he's probably on drugs, and left, right? What do you do with that? And so I don't know, I'm not sure, but this is what I do know, that as long as there is a civilian-ish force of people who are given license to use violence in the interest of safety, and when they breach that agreement, there's no consequences, I don't see how it gets better. And when I talk about consequences, I'm not a pro-death penalty person. I don't think a person needs to be, humiliated and flogged and isolated, but no consequences. Or even an opportunity to express their grief and sadness over the mistake that they've made, because we are in such a kind of a liability era, that to think that you take another human life and that you have no way to say, I'm so sorry, I can't believe what I did. When we think about what we saw in Ferguson, what we saw in Baltimore, what we saw in Louisville, we saw grief animated in the public square. And we have no mechanism, because of liability, because of union agreements, because of insurance policies, for a person to say, I am so sorry for what I did. I can't believe I did that. Because what's interesting is, if you look at the African-American kind of tradition of high profile acts of violence, forgiveness and Christianity often are at the center of it. If we look at the horrible massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, and the number of people who are talking about forgiveness and reconciliation towards Dylann Roof, I don't think that's even outside of the realm of possibility. But when you put policing in it, the thing that's so interesting about it is no one can talk, no one can admit fault, and the lawyers take care of it. So I think what you're talking about is a process that has to be done outside of these measures. But I don't know, those are the measures we rely on for accountability. So I'm not entirely hopeful that will necessarily change. But I also want to say something really clear, that although some African Americans have very strong critiques of the police, the majority of African Americans are anti-police and actually don't believe that you shouldn't have police presence. What they don't want is police brutality and excessive violence. That even though there's a kind of broad brush that African Americans are painted with in their relationships with the police, they are willing to tolerate some level of police activity if they feel like it promotes safety. What I think people are afraid of is a police force that is not discerning and has no accountability.
We're going to switch to some questions that I've gotten anonymously in the chat. The first one is, how do you manage conflict between students while trying to organize?
Ooh, such a good one. So conflict is an inevitable part of community building. Conflict can either enhance our relationships or undermine them. So I'm from the Midwest, and Pittsburgh kind of has a Midwestern feel with the various ethnic communities. Pittsburgh is one of my favorite cities, and in the before times, I really enjoyed visiting. But conflict is really hard, because the question is, what is the end goal? And I think among activist communities, we don't have enough histories of how conflict gets mediated. Sometimes we hear organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's like one day everyone got mad and went home, and then the organization was done. But I think what we have to understand is conflict is a healthy part of community building. And the best things that I think this new generation of activists have brought us is things like accountability, this idea of transparency, of using the resources of the community to deal with interpersonal conflict. And some people have used it to deal with issues like sexual harassment, sexual assault within communities. Like, how do we find a non-punitive and healing way to deal with conflict? Because one of the things that Brian Stevenson talks about, who is the writer of Just Mercy and has led this incredible memorial to racial violence in Alabama, is he said, we live in a culture that's so punitive and that's so based on shame that no one ever wants to admit they're wrong because they think that people are going to pile on them. So I think what you do among students is you're very clear as to what the breach is. This is how this harmed me, and this is how this is getting in the way of me doing the things that I really want and working on the things that I really want. I really believe on this issue. This conflict is making me feel uncomfortable. awkward, unable to do this next thing. And the more and more you grow in your capacity to communicate that, the more and more you give another person the opportunity to make the changes they need in order to not cause harm. So I get a lot of banana stuff like over email and social media. People say really mean things to me for a number of reasons, probably because I won't shut up about my political stuff, but this is America, right? Everyone gets to say something. People say some really cruel things to me. And I used to internalize a lot of that and just kind of like press it down. And then I'd feel like really tense and upset all the time and like wouldn't be able to have fun because I was like so upset. But what I've learned to do is to actually talk about the impact these things are having on me in order for them to kind of move out of the space internally so that I know that they can be there, I can get the support I need, and I can remain focused. And I think for groups, you have to do the same thing. And once you start doing that, you become more comfortable and you find yourself less kind of stifled by these experiences. Good luck.
Thank you. The next question circles back to what big state solutions can and should future administrations implement? Could defunding the police work? And what other actions could be taken to stop excessive drug charges, incarceration, militarization of police, poverty in African American communities, / all the other intertwined issues at hand?
The first thing, everyone just needs to pay their fair share into the common good. Taxes. Everything comes down to how much we have in the public good to make sure people are taken care of. So, you know, I'm a big critic of privatization and depending on corporate largesse or corporate benevolence to get things done. I don't have to worry about if McDonald's is hitting its goals or helping its shareholders and to worry about if McDonald's is going to donate to the United Negro College Fund. If we had a public system, maybe called taxes, that people can contribute to so we make sure that our basic needs are met. So I'm a big believer in the universal basic income. I did not support Andrew Yang in the primaries, but I'm glad he brought it up. And this was an idea that was embraced by Richard Nixon. You know what's really bananas? Richard Nixon, I think, was not a friend of civil rights, and I think he was a real problem. But it shows you how party ideology was in 1968 in the shadows of a kind of New Deal presidencies that someone like Richard Nixon could think about universal basic income, and it didn't alienate him from his colleagues in the Republican Party. So we've got universal basic income. We've got to have a very clear and robust way of doing public housing that isn't forcing people into private markets where they will be discriminated against. We have to take care of housing. And then healthcare, Medicare for all, I think is the bare minimum, because the pressure that people are put under systems of poverty exacerbate health problems. And then they're left in a system where they can't afford quality healthcare. We have to get to single payer because, I mean, this is ridiculous. I have a very good job and I make plenty of money. Some of my healthcare costs are inaccessible to me. That's just too much. And so I think that we have to come up with a system, because I think once we take care of the barriers to health access, then people will not be afraid of getting better and getting well. Paid sick leave. I mean, there's like all of these great ideas. Childcare. I actually think we can get this with this pandemic, because we have really seen the childcare crisis in this country with so many families having to work from home and have to provide childcare. I think that the pandemic may lead an opening to this, but from my perspective, I think the government should be paying all of us to stay at home right now to fight the coronavirus, because this is not sustainable in times of crisis, but it wasn't sustainable even before the coronavirus. So I think those are some of the big state things. I really do believe free college should be on the horizon. And what free college means is free public colleges. Carnegie Mellon, you can continue to charge tuition all you want, but for our public schools, we really do have to have a real affordable, accessible public education system in higher education. See? All of these ideas, and tons of people are talking about them. We could get through this tomorrow. I think Joe Biden should abuse executive orders to the 9th degree during his 4-year term. It will probably all be overturned in the Supreme Court, but I think you push the idea and then you kind of deal with the collateral damage. But again, this is why I'm not going to be on the transition team, and no one ever hires me for political advice.
Thank you. We have one more question from the chat before I turn it back to Dr. Skinner. And that question is just to touch on your comments about African Americans and police reconciliation. This person has heard many people, particularly evangelicals, discuss African American reconciliation with whites to get over the racist past. If this was possible, which this person doesn't think it is, do you believe there is a mechanism or a platform that could properly address this issue? Would it be a step in the right direction?
I think reparations would be a helpful step. So this idea of reconciliation without any kind of recompense, I think is really dangerous, because we know that Christianity has been deployed to try to tell African Americans to deal with slavery, your salvation will come later, or to be patient during times of racial violence in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I understand the reason why people recoil when you introduce kind of these Christian ideas of reconciliation as a way of dealing with racial racial harm. But I think that there's something that I've learned coming from the Catholic tradition and working at Georgetown, where they embarked on a journey around their history of slaveholding. And that is the idea that reconciliation is both powerful and insufficient. While I would often say that, like, what does saying sorry do, for slavery, if you think about all of the harm it's caused? But as someone who was able to witness the descendants of the people who were sold on behalf of the university, that sorry meant something. And I think that we have to sit with the discomfort that we can spend our whole lives trying to pay off the debt that we have to the system of American slavery, and we will never pay it off in our lifetimes. And that is the sacrifice we pay for the unearned privileges that the human sacrifice of others allows us. So I think I think reparations becomes part of it. And there are all of these very complicated questions about who should get what and how it's done. But I think that if we don't understand that the loss of wealth, that the loss of property, the loss of fortune on behalf of atoning for sins, if that's not part of the framework, then all of these gestures will feel empty. And so I think that what we can do is we can create a framework of repair, because we have to ask ourselves, how much is too much? How much does one person need? I mean, in the 1960s, people grappled with this idea of the paradox of plenty, that we have a nation that can be so prosperous and so wealthy, and at the same time, people unable to meet their basic needs. And I think we're still in that place. And so I would prefer to live with less. These are really, I grew up in the 80s, and every kind of characterization of communism was that nothing had color, that everyone lived in the same kind of house. This is the kind of propaganda you get from the 80s when you grow up. And some of it has some truth, but everyone has a yellow shirt and there's no blue shirts under communism. This is why it's bad. There are other reasons why you can critique communist states. But anyway, all of this is to say that if the choice is between having a yellow shirt and a blue shirt, and just a yellow shirt, and my neighbor doesn't have to be worried about being evicted or can go to the doctor, I'm fine with having just a yellow shirt. And I think we need to present this as a possibility. What can we actually do to be part of it? But I don't even think it needs great sacrifice. I think we just need taxes that are collected on a fair basis and redistributed to the people who need the most. And then we can see really what we're made of, because ultimately the paradox of this nation is that we are so innovative, and we have so many creative and thoughtful people. We have so many people who have fought for justice, but we don't know our full capacity because so many people have been left out of the process of leading and deciding and making our world better.
Thank you. Dr. Skinner, back to you.
Do we have one last question before I re-engage with our speaker? I think there's a hand up from Hillary. And,
no, I was just clapping. I thought
oh, you're
great.
just clapping. Sorry, she was clapping. Is there one last question? So I have a whole bunch of questions for you, and I know that our time is short, but I have to ask you this question. Around the issues that you work on, is there anything that President Donald Trump did right?
No, because he squandered the possibility of this country, because he was elected on a platform that I found widely unacceptable, but he was able to have a Senate, and he was able to have talented people around him, and his lack of discipline, his lack of care for the country, his lack of insight, he just squandered the opportunity. And so I don't think he did anything right. And the only thing I have ever agreed with the President of the United States on is I also think our airports should be better, but he didn't make any substantive moves in that direction. And so I think that, yeah.
Let me also ask you another question, and it sounds political, but it actually isn't, if you think about it, especially since we're both from Chicago.
Mhm.
Most of the major American cities that have intense Black populations, people of color, have been under Democratic control for half century or more. Why is it, with all of that money coming in to the police force, like in LA County, something like almost $2 billion annually, do we see the outcomes in these cities? They never get better. They tend to get worse.
Yeah.
But they're under full Democratic machines, mayors, often governors, city councils, aldermen. What's been going wrong?
I think that it's important to note that that the mandate of white supremacy can be executed by people of any color. So I don't believe that just because you have Black politicians or just because you have white politicians, you're going to necessarily get certain outcomes. I do know those cities were also hit really hard by deindustrialization in the late 60s and early 70s. And these cities also, with the end of the war on poverty and the change to federalism, also lost control over direct access to programs that I think were community-based and perhaps provided some outlets for self-governance, as well as the fact that these were cities that were really hit hard by the infiltration of drugs that some people have tied to a number of state factors. And so I think that, you know, these questions, and this is something that people bring up all the time, you know, the rise of Black political power, I think also coincided with the lack of political autonomy in those very cities. And so if you look at the election of people like Coleman Young in Detroit, if you look at Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, Harold Washington in Chicago, Tom Bradley, Carl Stokes in Cleveland, this is happening at the same time that there's deep federal retrenchment from the cities, as well as political coalition building in the suburbs to really vilify the cities. And so I think what it's a reflection of is the ways that we have seen that when African Americans are able to kind of break that glass ceiling and gain political power, a white supremacist structure will try to undermine that power as much as possible. And we saw that with the Black president and Black mayors and city councilmen, I think in many ways were canaries in the mine of what that was going to look like. But I do think that despite the failures of some of these political structures, we've seen incredible power and community resilience, and we've seen the strength of activism under great duress. And so I think that, you know, I think that shows us the real limits, and I think the real racism in American political systems, that even when you have the capacity for political representation, if you don't have the economic structures working, if you have the loss of jobs, if you have the disproportionate policing, and if you have the environmental racism, if you have all of these other factors, that political power alone can't make the difference.
And I'd also add that it leads the political power to straight toward corruption often for the variables that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this last administration shows what happens when, you know, actors are vulnerable to corruption because of their own economic interests. We see the kind of, you know, pay for play, and that has had a long tradition in the rise of, you know, the ethnic politician. And so I think that what we need is to start over. We just need a big do-over, everyone. And it would be awesome if we could do the do-over ourselves, or rather it happened to us. But There's so many different ways we could play this, that the thing that keeps me really excited is all the alternative ideas of how we can structure society to make sure everyone gets what they need and what they can imagine for themselves.
Well, I have more questions, but we're basically out of time. I'd like to thank Professor Chatelain for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'd love to be a student again and take one of your classes. I hope to see you in Pittsburgh at CMU in the future when we're in this redo America and there's no COVID and we're back together again. And I'd like to remind the audience that we have 2 speakers coming up in the next few days. We have Professor Conrad Tucker on Thursday, November 12th at 4:45. Stay tuned. He is a professor in the engineering school, and he is also African American. He's part of our Journey series. We look forward to hearing his thoughts about how he got to CMU and what he's learned and since he's been here, and it should be just a great conversation. So in advance, I thank Conrad for joining with us. Then on Friday, November 20th, we have former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice at noon. And this conversation is off the record and is reserved only for the CMU community. Instead of talking about national security and foreign policy, she will be talking about her own journey from the segregated South and race in America. And so these are among the end of the semester events that we have going on. There are a few more, but these are some of our really special ones, and we do hope that you'll be part of it. So let's give a round of virtual hand of applause for the team that put this event together and for our speaker. Thank you. Class dismissed. Bye.